Every family has its quirks, its odd traditions and whispered stories. But mine had something much darker. My grandmother's house, a creaking, time-worn Victorian relic on the outskirts of town, held a secret so heavy it cast a shadow over our family for decades. It was the room at the end of the hall, the one no one ever talked about. As a child, I would run through the long, narrow hallway with its faded wallpaper and creaky wooden floorboards. Every time, I'd pause in front of that door, the one painted appealing white, always locked, always cold to the touch. What's in there? I'd ask my grandmother. Her face would harden, her eyes darting to the door and then away, like even looking at it was dangerous. Some things are better left alone, she'd say. I asked my dad once, hoping for a better answer. His voice dropped to a whisper, like he was afraid someone or something might hear. Your great Aunt Evelyn died in that room when she was 23. After that, strange things started happening, so we locked it up. That's all you need to know. I was 8 years old then, and my curiosity burned. I wanted to know more, but every time I tried to ask, I was met with the same cold response. Don't ask about the room. For years, I obeyed. The room became a part of the house's eerie backdrop, like the ticking grandfather clock in the foyer or the way the pipes groaned in the middle of the night. We all avoided it without saying why, until the night of the storm. I was 19 and staying with my grandmother during a particularly brutal winter. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the windows and rattling the walls. By midnight, the power had gone out, plunging the house into darkness. My grandmother, ever superstitious, lit candles in every room and went to bed early, leaving me alone in the flickering gloom. I sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around me, scrolling through my phone until the battery died. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creak, 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 like someone rocking back and forth on an old wooden chair. It was coming from the end of the hall, from the room. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. The sound was faint but deliberate, a slow and steady rhythm that seemed to echo down the hallway. My rational brain tried to explain it away. It's just the wind, or maybe the old pipes. But deep down, I knew. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and made my way toward the sound, the beam of light trembling in my hand. The hallway stretched out in front of me, impossibly long in the darkness. The closer I got to the room, the colder the air became until my breath came out in visible puffs. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I could still hear the rocking, louder now, and beneath it, something else. A whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably a voice, soft, urgent, and coming from inside. I told myself I would just look, just one quick peek, and then I'd go back to bed and forget about it. I wrapped my fingers around the doorknob, which was ice cold, and turned it. The door creaked open, and for a moment, all I could see was darkness. Then the beam of my flashlight landed on the rocking chair by the window. There was someone sitting in it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flashlight. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw her more clearly. A woman, her body unnaturally still, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a tattered black dress that looked as though it had been pulled from a grave. Her hair was long and stringy, hanging over her face like a curtain. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes like two dark voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. She didn't blink. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she were about to speak. That's when the whispering started again, louder this time. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with a sound that made my skin crawl. Why did you come here? The words weren't spoken. They were in my head, like a thought that wasn't my own. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but I could still see her, outlined in the faint glow of the storm outside. She was standing now, her movements unnaturally jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop shaking, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The next morning, I told my grandmother what had happened. Her face went pale, and for the first time, she told me the truth about the room and the woman trapped inside it. Evelyn hadn't just died in that room. She'd been murdered by someone she trusted, and her restless spirit had been trapped there ever since. My grandmother had tried everything to banish her, priests, psychics, even sealing the room, but nothing worked. Evelyn didn't want to leave. "She's waiting," my grandmother whispered, "for someone to join her." I moved out of that house as soon as I could, but I've never stopped thinking about that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my own home, I swear I can still hear it. The soft, rhythmic creak, creak, creak of a rocking chair in the distance. For years, I tried to bury that night deep in my mind. I convinced myself it was just a bad dream, an overactive imagination, mixed with the eerie atmosphere of the storm. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. It started subtly, years after I had left my grandmother's house. At first, it was little things. Doors that I knew I'd close would be open, lights flickering even when the power was stable, and cold drafts sweeping through my apartment despite no open windows. I ignored them, chalking it up to coincidence or faulty wiring. But then the dreams began. Every night, I found myself back in that hallway, standing in front of the door. In the dream, I would hear the same soft creak, creak, creak. My hand would reach out for the doorknob, even though I didn't want it to. No matter how much I screamed in my head to stop, the door would always swing open, and she would be there, sitting in the chair waiting. And every night, she'd stand up a little closer to me. I tried to ignore it, but the dream started bleeding into my waking life. I'd hear whispers in the middle of the day, faint but unmistakable. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, heavier, like they were watching me. The rocking sound followed me everywhere, on quiet streets, in the stillness of my office, even in the hum of crowded rooms. One night, as I sat in bed, trying to shake off the latest nightmare, I heard it clearly, the soft creak of a rocking chair. Except this time, it wasn't in my head. It was coming from the living room. I froze, clutching my blanket, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, I forced myself to get up and creep toward the sound. The house was silent except for the rhythmic creaking. When I reached the living room, I saw it. There, in the corner of the room, was a rocking chair that I didn't own. It was old and splintered, just like the one in my grandmother's house. And sitting in it was a figure shrouded in shadow. "Why did you leave me?" the voice whispered. I backed away, stumbling over the coffee table. The figure didn't move, but the shadows around it began to twist and writhe like living things. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the voice said, growing louder, more insistent. I ran out of the house that night, leaving everything behind. I slept in my car, parked in a brightly lit lot, too terrified to close my eyes. The next morning, I went back to my grandmother's house. I hadn't been there in years, not since she passed away and the house had been left empty. It looked the same as it always had, weathered and silent, the curtains drawn tight. But stepping inside felt like walking into the past. The hallway was just as I remembered it, and at the end, the door to that room was still closed. I don't know what compelled me to go back. Maybe I thought confronting it would make it stop. Maybe I hoped that whatever had been haunting me would stay behind, trapped in that house where it belonged. But as I approached the door, I knew that wasn't true. The air grew colder with every step, and the whispers started again, faint and insidious, like 100 voices speaking just out of reach. This time, the door wasn't locked. It swung open at the slightest touch, revealing the room exactly as I remembered it. The peeling wallpaper, the icy air, and the rocking chair by the window. But this time, the chair was empty. Evelyn, I whispered, my voice shaking. The whisper stopped. The air grew impossibly still. Then, from the shadows, she emerged. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and wrong, like every joint in her body had been broken and reset. Her face was even worse than I remembered, sunken, hollow, and filled with a rage that seemed to burn through the room. "You let me out," she hissed. The room seemed to collapse around me, the walls bending inward, the light fading until there was nothing but her face, inches from mine. Her hands, ice cold and impossibly strong, gripped my shoulders, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember, I was outside, standing in the snow with no memory of how I got there. I sold my grandmother's house the next day, but it didn't help. Evelyn followed me, her whispers growing louder, her presence more oppressive. The rocking chair appeared in every place I moved, always in the corner, always waiting. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. She's getting stronger, and every time I close my eyes, she's closer. If you're reading this, take my warning seriously. If you ever find a room no one speaks about, a door no one dares to open, leave it alone, because once you let her out, she'll never let you go.